Transformers. The last night begins in the brutal chaos of the Dark Ages. The battlefield is already in turmoil. Massive stones rain down from above, smashing into soldiers and tearing through formations like meteors. Steel clashes against steel as warriors scream and charge into one another. Through the noise, one desperate voice cries out, demanding to know where the magician is. Another answers with forced confidence, he's coming. Armies surge forward, mounted knights thundering across the field while infantry collide in violent waves. Flaming arrows streak through the sky, igniting the ground below. Amid all of this, the scene abruptly cuts to the man they've been waiting for, Merlin. But instead of a legendary hero, he's a disheveled, intoxicated figure, barely steady on his feet, clutching a drink as he stumbles uphill. He reaches a secluded cave perched above the battlefield. Inside, the atmosphere shifts instantly. A towering transformer emerges from the shadows and slams Merlin against the stone wall. Terrified but desperate, Merlin begs for help, insisting he's kept their existence a secret. He pleads not for himself, but for the innocent lives at stake, men, women, children who will be wiped out if nothing is done. Something in his words lands. The Transformer pauses, then calls upon ancient allies, the Guardian Knights. One by one, they appear, shifting into formation and presenting Merlin with a powerful relic, a staff radiating immense energy. The Transformer entrusts it to him, warning that this object must be protected at all costs, because someday, something far worse will come searching for it. The knights then merge together, transforming into a colossal mechanical dragon. Guided by the staff, Merlin takes control. The dragon launches into the sky, diving straight into the battle below. What follows is total destruction. Enemy forces are obliterated in seconds. Fire, steel, and chaos give way to silence. The battle is over. Victory is absolute. The story then leaps forward over 1,600 years. Drifting through the emptiness of space, Optimus Prime floats alone, battered and silent. A recorded message from him plays. He's calling out to his creators, pleading with them to spare Earth from further destruction. Back on Earth, the situation has changed. Humanity has formed a global military unit known as the TRF, the Transformers Reaction Force, tasked with hunting down and controlling all Transformer activity. Yet oddly, not everywhere is hostile. In Cuba, Transformers are allowed to live freely, even lounging peacefully under the sun like tourists. Despite the unimaginable scale of the universe, countless planets stretching beyond comprehension, Transformers keep arriving on Earth. The focus shifts to a group of kids wandering through the ruins of a devastated area. Curious and reckless, they stumble upon a crashed alien spacecraft. Inside, they discover what appears to be a lifeless Transformer, until it suddenly jolts awake, sending them into panic. Before they can react further, a robotic unit working under the Department of Homeland Security arrives and orders them out. Just as things escalate, a man nearby distracts the machine, giving the kids a chance to escape. They scatter, but not without consequences. One of the girls carries a tiny Transformer companion, now damaged in the chaos. Taking shelter beneath collapsed debris, the kids encounter a larger Transformer named Canopy. Gentle despite his size, he shields them and guides them out. Meanwhile, the TRF locks onto his signal, scanning to confirm whether he's a Decepticon. Uncertain and unwilling to risk civilian casualties, they hesitate. But the moment the children are clear, the hesitation ends. A missile is launched. Canopy is obliterated instantly. At that exact moment, Cade Yeager storms into the scene in his truck, firing a heavy weapon at TRF units without hesitation. Bumblebee joins him, tearing through enemy machines with precision. Cade pulls the kids into his vehicle, and they speed away from danger. During the escape, the kids casually mention there's a bounty on Cade's head. His response? A half-serious threat to knock one of them out, more frustration than anger. But Cade isn't done yet. He turns back for the wounded Transformer they encountered earlier. The dying machine reaches out and presses a strange metallic talisman into Cade's hand, urging him to protect it, then shuts down. Before Cade can leave, TRF operatives surround him, weapons raised. They demand answers. Where are the other Transformers? Suddenly, Bumblebee intervenes in spectacular fashion. His body breaks apart mid-air, scattering into pieces before snapping back together behind them. The display stuns everyone. "Easy," he signals. "Until you're sure, don't pull the trigger." In seconds, he disables every weapon aimed at them. The soldiers, now defenseless, shift from aggression to negotiation. Then the TRF commander arrives, ordering a ceasefire. Cade steps forward, making his stance clear. The Transformers aren't the enemy. They just want a place to exist. He's leaving, with or without permission. Reluctantly, the TRF lets them go. Back at their base, analysis of the fallen Transformer reveals something shocking. It's older than even Optimus Prime. Elsewhere, a Decepticon disguised as a police vehicle meets with Megatron. He reports that the object they've been searching for, the talisman, has finally surfaced. And with the TRF unknowingly tracking it, finding it will be easier than ever. Far across space, Optimus crashes onto the broken remains of Cybertron. The once great world lies in ruin. As he struggles to understand what happened, a mysterious figure emerges, Quintessa, his creator. She's been waiting. Without hesitation, she overwhelms him, accusing him of causing the planet's destruction. According to her, he now has one purpose: to fix it. And if he fails, the entire Transformer race will cease to exist. Back on Earth, in an ancient English estate, Castle Fulan, a Transformer, delivers urgent news to Sir Edmund Burton. The final knight has been found, and the talisman has chosen its bearer. The story transitions to University of Oxford, where Professor Vivian Wimbley is delivering a lecture on the Dark Ages conflict, the very battle we witnessed earlier. She breaks down the history with sharp clarity, challenging conventional interpretations. Watching quietly from a distance is Sir Edmund Burton, studying her with growing interest, clearly intrigued by both her knowledge and perspective. The narrative then cuts back to Optimus Prime on the shattered remains of Cybertron. Quintessa reveals a critical truth. The powerful staff, the very source used to create Transformers, is hidden on Earth. She commands Optimus to retrieve it. Though conflicted, he ultimately submits to her will. Back on Earth, we find Cade Yeager and his Autobot companions living in a scrapyard, their improvised refuge. Life there is anything but peaceful, especially with the Dinobots around. Chaos erupts as Grimlock, the massive T-Rex Dinobot, casually devours abandoned vehicles like snacks. Cade, fed up, scolds him like an unruly pet and jokingly orders him to stand in a naughty corner, adding a rare moment of humor. Amid the commotion, a scavenger transformer named Day Trader shows up, offering supplies and spare parts. Among them is a replacement voice box for Bumblebee. However, Day Trader's attention quickly shifts to the mysterious talisman in Cade's possession. He tries to bargain for it, but Cade refuses. Even without fully understanding it, he senses the object carries serious weight. Later, a young girl named Isabela approaches Cade, desperate and determined. She pleads for a place among them, revealing that the TRF killed the only being she had left, a Transformer she considered family, and that her parents were lost to a Decepticon attack. Despite her painful story, Cade initially insists she return home. But before leaving, she surprises him by correctly answering a technical question about repairing Transformers. Her knowledge is undeniable. Cade hesitates, his decision no longer so certain. The scene shifts to Namibia, where something extraordinary is happening. A massive metallic horn is slowly pushing its way out of the ground, rising several meters each day. Reports confirm similar structures emerging across the globe, including in China and other locations, 6 in total. According to Burton, this phenomenon signals one thing: Cybertron itself is approaching Earth. At the White House, scientists brief government officials on a terrifying development. A planet-sized mass is on a direct course toward Earth, traveling at unimaginable speed. The conclusion is blunt: if it reaches Earth, survival is impossible. Back at the junkyard, Cade speaks with his daughter Tessa over the phone, now away at college. Meanwhile, tensions rise elsewhere as the TRF discusses the return of Megatron. He has captured 2 of their operatives and is using them as leverage. His demand is simple: release his imprisoned Decepticons. He lists them one by one: Mohawk, Dreadbot, Nitro Zeus, and Berserker. The TRF refuses to free Berserker, but compromises by offering Onslaught instead. When asked what he truly wants, Megatron gives a chillingly simple answer: he wants to go home. With the deal made, the Decepticons regroup, ready to hunt down Cade and recover the talisman. Back at the scrapyard, Cade and Isabela attempt to install Bumblebee's new voice box. But the result is unexpected. Instead of restoring his voice, it gives him a strangely comedic female tone, completely out of place. The moment provides a brief laugh before everything goes wrong. The TRF and Decepticons close in simultaneously. The Autobots scramble to evacuate, but not everyone sticks to the plan. One Autobot charges straight into battle against Megatron. Amid the chaos, they discover something worse, a tracking device hidden on Bumblebee. Realization hits hard. Their location was never secure. The enemy closes in fast. As the Decepticons threaten Isabela's small Transformer companion, she steps forward without fear, confronting Megatron directly. But her bravery unintentionally exposes their position. Cade reacts instantly, firing an alien weapon at Megatron, creating just enough distraction for an escape. During the retreat, one of the ancient Guardian Knights appears, shielding Cade and the others. In the confusion, the Autobots manage to take down one Decepticon. Bumblebee eliminates Mohawk in a swift takedown, but the victory is short-lived. TRF drones and Decepticons continue the pursuit relentlessly, tearing through the building where Cade's group is hiding. One of Cade's allies realizes the drones are identifying targets using facial recognition. In a desperate move, he steps forward to trick the system, but it recognizes his connection to Cade and fires, knocking him down with a beanbag round. Meanwhile, the mysterious Transformer who had earlier warned Burton about the coming catastrophe arrives to retrieve Cade. Just as things seem under control, Cade is suddenly shoved out of an elevator by a drone. He plummets. But somehow, against all odds, he survives, leaping between drones mid-air before landing safely. The Transformer introduces himself as Cogman and urgently contacts Burton, explaining that the situation is escalating fast. Once Cade regains his footing, Cogman delivers a shocking revelation. Cade has been chosen. Realizing that staying behind will only endanger his team further, Cade makes a difficult decision. He agrees to leave with Cogman. Soon after, Cade boards a flight to the United Kingdom alongside him, heading to meet Burton. During their journey, Burton receives a call from Simmons, who informs him that a long-sought book has finally been located. Elsewhere, back on Cybertron, Quintessa reveals her ultimate truth to Optimus. Earth has another name, Unicron, the ancient enemy of Cybertron itself. With the staff, she intends to drain Unicron's energy to restore her world. Under her influence, Optimus begins to change, his resolve bending as he accepts the mission. Finally, the focus returns to Vivian Wembley. Before leaving her home, she shares a brief exchange with her mother, an ordinary moment, quietly placed before everything is about to change. As Vivian Wembley steps into her car, something immediately feels off. The doors suddenly lock on their own, and before she can react, the vehicle begins moving, without her touching anything. Panic sets in. She tries to force her way out, even smashing the window in desperation. But then, the car speaks. It calmly introduces itself as Hot Rod, revealing that it's not just a car, it's a transformer. Before she can process that, the vehicle transforms, shifting from a modest European car into a sleek Lamborghini right before her eyes. Vivian is left stunned. The scene shifts back to Cade Yeager, Cogman, and Bumblebee as they arrive at Burton's grand estate. Sir Edmund Burton greets them, though his eccentric rambling immediately raises Cade's suspicion. He even wonders what Burton has been smoking. Burton explains his obsession. He spent his life trying to understand why Transformers keep coming to Earth. Moments later, Hot Rod arrives with Vivian. Burton formally introduces her, reciting her long list of academic achievements. The praise only makes Cade feel out of place, and he responds by poking fun at her accent. The tension is instant. Cogman, ever devoted to his master's guests, doesn't take kindly to the insult. He launches at Cade, ready to defend Vivian's honor. The situation escalates quickly until Burton steps in and shuts it down before things get out of control. With everyone gathered, Burton reveals the truth about his lineage. For generations, his family has protected a hidden history, one that ties Transformers to Earth's past. He then drops a revelation. Vivian's father was part of this secret order. The narrative briefly flashes back, showing Bumblebee during World War II, fighting alongside the Allied forces, specifically the Devil's Brigade, helping turn the tide against Nazi troops. The glimpse reinforces just how deeply Transformers have been involved in human history. Returning to the present, Burton recounts the events of the Dark Ages. He explains that 12 Cybertronian knights once defended humanity, believing humans possessed honor worth protecting. According to legend, one final knight would eventually be chosen. That knight, Burton declares, is Cade, a struggling inventor from Texas, somehow destined for greatness. Burton lists the qualities of a true knight honor: courage, integrity, purity, and awkwardly questions Cade about his personal life, even hinting at celibacy. Cade immediately shuts him down, making it clear that's none of Burton's concern. Shifting focus, Burton explains the significance of Merlin's staff. It was buried alongside Merlin, hidden away for centuries. Only someone of Merlin's bloodline can wield it. That person is Vivian. As Merlin's last known descendant, she's the only one who can access its power. She already knows where it's hidden, but the final clue left behind by her father still needs to be solved. Their conversation is abruptly interrupted when government forces arrive at the estate. With no time to waste, the Autobots, Cade, and Vivian make their escape. Eventually, they regroup at Vivian's home. Meanwhile, Burton receives another update from Simmons regarding the ancient book he's been searching for. Realizing time is slipping away, Burton grows increasingly anxious. Back at Vivian's house, she and Cade begin searching for clues. Their investigation quickly turns chaotic as they tear through her office in the process. Books, papers, everything ends up scattered. Burton reconnects with Simmons, who finally reveals what the book contains. The message is grim. Only one world will survive, either Cybertron or Earth. One will drain the life from the other. Back in the house, Cade and Vivian uncover their first breakthrough, a hidden compartment. Inside, they find the clue pointing them toward the next destination. The staff is located at the Navy Museum. Before they can act, special forces storm the house. Downstairs, the occupants surrender. At the same time, Burton and Cogman are already on the run, evading authorities. They receive a call from Cade and Vivian, instructing them to regroup at the museum. What follows is a full-scale chase. Authorities close in, Decepticons join the pursuit, and chaos unfolds across the streets. Bumblebee transforms mid-action, blasting a Decepticon police vehicle that's closing in fast. The team pushes forward. They reach the museum, the place that could change everything. Burton, understanding the weight of what lies ahead, makes a decision. He steps back, accepting that his role has reached its end. The future now belongs to them. Cade, Vivian, and their allies move forward alone. Inside, they uncover something extraordinary: a transformer submarine hidden beneath the museum. They board it and escape underwater. But they're not safe. The TRF quickly tracks their position and launches a missile. The impact sends the submarine shooting upward, nearly vertical. Somehow, they manage to survive the near disaster as the stakes climb even higher. Amid all this tension, Cogman attempts something unexpected. He arranges a date between Cade and Vivian. Both are visibly uncomfortable, unsure how to act in such a bizarre situation. Elsewhere, Burton secretly meets with the Prime Minister. At first, he's treated as a threat, but once Burton reveals who he truly is, the tone shifts. The Prime Minister orders his men to stand down and listen. Burton doesn't waste time. He tells him to mobilize everything, every military asset available, because the end is coming, and he knows exactly when and where. Back with Cade, Cogman explains the importance of the talisman. It isn't just an artifact, it's a key. A key that can unlock an ancient ship dating back to the Dark Ages, and whatever lies inside it could decide the fate of the world. The pursuit doesn't let up. Through thick ocean mist, the TRF finally catches sight of the ancient ship. As they close in, a violent current pulls them off course, slamming their vessel into a massive wall and temporarily knocking them out of the chase. At the same time, global monitoring systems confirm the worst scientists tracking the incoming celestial body report that it's now dangerously close. Impact is imminent, with catastrophic destruction expected in less than 12 hours. Back with Cade's allies, the warning spreads quickly. Realizing time is running out, they regroup and head toward England aboard their own transformer vessel, now fully operational. Inside the mysterious ship, Cade Yeager, Vivian Wembley, Cogman, and Bumblebee uncover something extraordinary: a sealed chamber believed to hold the resting place of the 12 Guardian Knights. As they explore, the TRF secretly breaches the ship, closing in from behind. Vivian studies ancient Celtic symbols etched into the floor. As her hand brushes against them, the chamber begins to shift. Stone grinds against stone as Merlin's tomb slowly rises from beneath the ground. Cade and Vivian pry it open. Inside lies Merlin's remains, but the staff is nowhere to be found. Frustration boils over. Cade lashes out, searching wildly, and in doing so, accidentally awakens one of the ancient knights. The warrior springs to life and immediately attacks, assuming Cade has taken what belongs to them. The TRF intervenes, firing at the knight to keep Cade alive. In the chaos, Vivian finally locates the staff. The moment she grips it, its power surges to life, illuminating the chamber with overwhelming energy. Then, everything changes. Optimus Prime arrives, no longer himself. Under Quintessa's control, now known as Nemesis Prime, he demands the staff. Without hesitation, he takes it and departs, heading back toward Cybertron. Bumblebee refuses to let him go. A brutal fight erupts between them, ally against ally. Optimus, blinded and relentless, nearly kills him. But in a pivotal moment, Bumblebee speaks, not through a radio, but with his true voice. The sound cuts through everything. Optimus freezes. The control breaks. Horrified at what he's done, he returns to his true self. But before they can recover, Megatron seizes the opportunity. He and his Decepticons snatch the staff and escape, heading straight for Cybertron. The Guardian Knights, furious over the betrayal, turn on Optimus, preparing to execute him. But before they strike, something unexpected happens. The talisman Cade carries transforms, reshaping itself into a sword. Without hesitation, Cade steps forward and defends Optimus, standing his ground against the Knights. In that moment, he proves himself, the last knight. The ancient warriors recognize his worth and stand down. Optimus, now fully himself again, expresses remorse and pledges to make things right. Together, they join forces with the Knights, preparing for a final confrontation against Quintessa. Meanwhile, Cybertron collides with Earth's atmosphere, tearing across the sky like a second world crashing into reality. The impact triggers global devastation, cities crumble, landscapes fracture, and chaos spreads across the planet. As humanity scrambles for survival, the Decepticons activate a massive portal, beginning the process of draining Earth's energy. Sir Edmund Burton makes one final stand. He attempts to stall the Decepticons, buying time for the TRF to engage, but his effort comes at a cost. He is fatally shot. Cogman is devastated, mourning the man he served with unwavering loyalty, calling him the finest human he had ever known. Reinforcements finally arrive. Cade's scrapyard crew, including Isabela and the remaining Autobots, join the battle. Optimus heads out to recover the staff, as Quintessa begins extracting Earth's life force to restore Cybertron. Entire cities are ripped apart as energy is siphoned away. A scientist confirms the terrifying reality. Earth is being drained, left on the verge of becoming lifeless. With no alternatives left, humans and Autobots unite for one final assault. Fighter jets take to the skies alongside the massive mechanical dragon from the Dark Ages. Together, they launch a full-scale aerial attack to intercept the staff and stop Quintessa. The sky erupts into chaos explosions, laser fire, and high-speed combat as aircraft, transformers, and the dragon clash in an all-out battle. During the assault, the human aircraft is forced down, crash landing amidst the destruction. Against all odds, the team survives. On the ground, Cade and the others push forward, determined to reclaim the staff. Bumblebee and the Autobots hold the line, fending off Decepticons to protect them. Megatron wreaks havoc across the battlefield, but Bumblebee steps in, confronting him head-on to shield the humans. Even as orders come through to abort the mission, Cade and Vivian refuse to back down. Then, Optimus returns. Riding the dragon into battle, he crashes through enemy lines, taking down multiple Decepticons in a breathtaking display of power. Cade and Vivian press toward the staff, where Quintessa continues draining Earth's energy. Megatron moves to eliminate Vivian, but Optimus intercepts him, overpowering him in a decisive clash. With seconds to spare, Vivian reaches the staff and takes hold of it. The energy transfer stops instantly. Earth is saved. Quintessa attempts to intervene, but Bumblebee delivers a perfectly timed shot, striking her down, seemingly ending her. The battle ends. The immediate threat is gone, but the damage is immense. Earth survives, though deeply scarred. Optimus addresses both humans and Autobots, revealing a deeper truth. Earth and Cybertron are connected, bound together in ways not yet fully understood. Both must be protected. Taking responsibility, he claims the staff, ensuring it can never be misused again, and departs, continuing his mission to defend the universe. But the story doesn't end there. In a final scene, a mysterious woman with a faint purple glow approaches a man. She introduces herself as Quintessa, alive, hidden in a new form. She warns him away from a particular object and cryptically reveals another truth. Earth has a name, Unicron. Before we even get into Transformers, The Last Night itself, we need to clear something up. This isn't coming from someone who hates Transformers. In fact, it's the opposite. There's a real history here, one that matters. For a lot of people, this franchise isn't just another blockbuster series. It started with something genuinely fun. The animated shows had charm, energy, personality. They weren't trying to overwhelm you, they were trying to entertain you. The characters felt distinct. The tone was playful, and there was a sense of identity that made it easy to connect with, even when the stories were simple. Even the original animated film had that strange, guilty pleasure appeal that made it memorable despite its flaws. It understood its own tone. It knew when to be sincere, when to be over the top, and when to just let the spectacle exist without losing the audience in the process. And when the live-action era began with Transformers, there was still something there. That first film worked not just because of its scale, but because it had a center. It grounded the chaos through character perspective, through a sense of discovery, through moments that allowed the audience to actually process what they were seeing. It balanced its spectacle with accessibility. Even as things started slipping with Transformers, Revenge of the Fallen, there was still a lingering sense that the franchise hadn't completely drifted away from that foundation. It was uneven, sometimes unfocused, but they hadn't fully abandoned the idea of engagement. Then came Transformers, Dark of the Moon, Transformers, Age of Extinction, and slowly you could feel the shift becoming more pronounced. Not a sudden collapse, but a steady transformation in priorities. The film started leaning harder into escalation for its own sake. Bigger stakes, louder sequences, more mythology layered on top, but without the same level of narrative clarity to support it. It's not just that the films got more chaotic, it's that they became less anchored. The spectacle expanded, but the connection narrowed. Each film got bigger, louder, more excessive. But at the same time, something else was happening. They were getting emptier, not in terms of content, but in terms of cohesion. Scenes felt less like parts of a unified whole and more like isolated bursts of energy stitched together. The pacing became more relentless, but not necessarily more purposeful. And by the time The Last Night arrives, that trajectory feels complete. It doesn't feel like a new direction. It feels like the logical endpoint of everything that had been building, where every creative instinct that once added excitement has been pushed to its limit. This isn't a reaction built on bias. It's not someone walking in ready to dismiss it. If anything, there's a level of patience here, even hope, the kind of hope that comes from familiarity, from wanting something you followed for years to find its footing again. There's an expectation, not of perfection, but of recalibration, of rediscovering that balance between spectacle and substance that once made the series work. But instead, what you get feels like the endpoint of everything the franchise had been building toward, for better and for worse. Because The Last Night doesn't just continue the formula, it amplifies it in a way that feels almost self-perpetuating. It takes every defining element, scale, mythology, action, complexity, and pushes them further, but without reevaluating how those elements function together. It's escalation without reflection. Everything that defined these films is still here, just pushed further. The scale is bigger. The mythology is heavier. The action is louder. The storytelling is more complicated. And yet, it feels like it matters less than ever. Not because nothing is happening, but because so much is happening without clear emotional or narrative grounding. The film is constantly moving, constantly expanding, but rarely pausing to give those moments weight. That's what makes this perspective important. This isn't about rejecting what Transformers is. It's about recognizing what it used to be, what it became, and where it finally starts to fracture. Because when a franchise reaches a point where even longtime viewers, people who grew up with it, defended it, found enjoyment in its chaos, start to feel that disconnect, that's not just criticism, that's a signal, a moment where the identity of the series begins to drift beyond recognition. Now here's the thing, for all its problems, and there are a lot, The Last Night still knows how to present itself like a blockbuster, and that's important. Because if there's one area where this franchise has consistently delivered, it's in spectacle. From the very first frame, you can see the intent. The film isn't just trying to be big, it's trying to dominate your attention. The scale is massive. The visuals are aggressive. The film operates with a kind of constant intensity, where every frame feels designed to overwhelm. Cities, battlefields, skies filled with machinery, everything is constructed to feel larger than life, almost to the point where subtlety is completely removed from the equation. It's not just spectacle, it's saturation. And technically, it's hard to deny the craftsmanship. The CGI is incredibly detailed. The Transformers themselves, despite being over-designed at times, carry a level of intricacy that reflects an immense amount of technical effort. Every transformation is layered, mechanical, complex in a way that showcases the sheer capability of modern visual effects. There's a density to the designs that makes them feel tangible, even when they become visually overwhelming. You can sense the precision behind it. The way each component moves, the way the metallic surfaces catch light, the way the transformations are choreographed. It all speaks to a level of technical discipline that hasn't diminished, even as other aspects have. There are moments where the film almost pauses, not narratively, but visually. And in those moments, you can actually appreciate the scale of what's been created. And that's where it works. Because when the film gives you just enough space to absorb the imagery, the spectacle becomes effective. Not just as noise, but as something you can process, something you can actually feel. The use of large format cameras, especially IMAX, adds another dimension to that experience. Certain sequences carry a sharpness and clarity that elevate the visuals beyond standard blockbuster presentation. When the framing aligns with the scale, when the movement slows just enough, you get a glimpse of what this film is capable of at its best. The size isn't just implied, it's experienced. And then there's the sound. Because this film doesn't just want you to watch it, it wants to hit you. The sound design is dense, mechanical, aggressive in a way that reinforces the visual intensity. Every transformation carries a distinct weight. Every impact feels engineered to resonate. It's not subtle, it's deliberately physical. Layered on top of that is the score, which quietly becomes one of the film's more effective tools. Because while the narrative often struggles to create emotional momentum, the music steps in to fill that space. It gives scenes a sense of importance, a sense of scale that the story doesn't always justify. It adds cohesion where the structure lacks it. There are moments where the score almost elevates the material beyond what's on screen. It suggests depth. It suggests meaning. It creates the illusion of something larger, something more unified. And for brief stretches, that illusion holds. But here's the catch. All of this, every visual, every sound, every technical achievement, it's carrying a weight it shouldn't have to carry alone. Because underneath that spectacle, there isn't enough structure to support it. The film leans on its technical strengths, not just to enhance the experience, but to compensate for what's missing. And you can feel that imbalance. Because the more the film throws at you visually, the more you start to notice the absence of cohesion beneath it. The spectacle becomes constant, but not cumulative. It doesn't build, it just continues. It becomes overwhelming instead of immersive. Impressive, but not engaging. There's a difference between being surrounded by spectacle and being pulled into it, and this film often leans toward the former. And that's the contradiction at the heart of it. The Last Night might be one of the most technically polished entries in the franchise, but that polish is doing more than just enhancing the experience. It's holding it together. But at the same time, it's also one of the clearest examples of how far visuals alone can take you, and exactly where that momentum starts to break down. Because there's a point where technical achievement stops translating into emotional engagement, where scale becomes surface level, where the experience shifts from immersive to exhausting. And that's where the film quietly reveals its limits. There's one element in The Last Night that almost never gets enough credit, and that's the music. Because while everything else in this film is constantly competing, explosions layered over dialogue, action sequences stacked back to back, scenes rushing forward without pause, the score is operating on a completely different wavelength. It isn't trying to be louder. It isn't trying to dominate. It's trying to unify. From the moment it kicks in, you can feel that intention. The music doesn't sit passively in the background. It actively shapes the emotional framework of each scene. It gives structure to moments that otherwise feel scattered. It creates a sense of continuity in a film that often lacks it. And more importantly, it tries to guide your reaction. It tells you how this is supposed to feel, even when the film itself isn't communicating that clearly. It adds scale where the story feels thin, not just by being grand, but by being deliberate. There's a weight to the compositions, a sense of build-up, of progression that suggests something meaningful is happening, even when the narrative isn't fully supporting that idea. It adds emotion where the characters don't quite deliver, filling in gaps that performances and writing leave behind. And it builds tension in moments that might otherwise feel empty, giving them a sense of purpose they don't inherently have. And at times, it almost carries the entire scene on its own, not by overpowering it, but by stabilizing it, by creating a consistent emotional thread that the rest of the film struggles to maintain. There's a sense of grandeur in the score that the film is constantly reaching for, but doesn't always achieve visually or narratively. And what's interesting is that the music doesn't just match the scale of the film. It tries to elevate it beyond what's actually there. It suggests a level of importance, a level of epic storytelling that exists more in tone than in execution. It makes moments feel bigger than they actually are, more significant, more connected to something larger. Even when the film becomes chaotic, when scenes blur together, when the pacing becomes relentless, the score remains controlled. It has direction. It knows exactly what tone it's aiming for, and it commits to it fully. And that consistency becomes incredibly important because it provides a kind of emotional anchor. While the film jumps between styles, action, comedy, mythology, spectacle, the music stays grounded in that epic cinematic identity. It keeps reinforcing what this experience is supposed to feel like, even when the film itself drifts away from that clarity. There are sequences where the visuals are overwhelming, the editing is frantic, and the storytelling feels fragmented, but the music pulls everything together just enough to create the illusion of cohesion. It smooths over the transitions. It connects moments that aren't structurally connected. It gives scenes a beginning, middle, and end, even when the film doesn't clearly define those boundaries. And that's not easy. In fact, it might be one of the most difficult roles a score can take on, elevating material that isn't consistently working while still maintaining its own identity. It's not just supporting the film, it's compensating for it. But at the same time, there's a limit to what it can do, because no matter how powerful the music is, it can't create emotional investment out of nothing. It can enhance what's already there, but it can't replace what's missing. And eventually, you start to feel that strain. You start to notice that the score is doing more work than it should, that it's trying to lift scenes that don't have enough weight on their own, and when that happens, the illusion starts to fade. The music is still effective, but you become aware of the gap between what it's suggesting and what the film is actually delivering. It becomes less about elevation and more about effort. Still, if there's one part of The Last Night that consistently delivers on what this franchise promises, it's this. The music doesn't just support the film, it actively tries to hold it together. It gives it shape, tone, and a sense of identity that other elements struggle to maintain. In many ways, it becomes the emotional backbone of the experience. Amid all the chaos, all the noise, all the overload, there are moments where The Last Night actually comes alive. And almost every time that happens, it's because of the people inside it. Not the scale, not the spectacle, but the performances that manage to cut through all of that. Let's start with the most obvious one, Anthony Hopkins, because the moment he enters the film, something shifts. It's immediate. The tone doesn't change entirely, but it stabilizes. Suddenly, there's presence. There's intention behind the performance. There's a sense that someone on screen understands how to navigate the kind of material this film is working with. Hopkins doesn't just play his role, he calibrates it. He leans into the absurdity without being consumed by it. He gives the character a level of seriousness that grounds the exposition, but he never lets it become rigid or lifeless. There's a kind of controlled unpredictability in his performance, like he's aware of how exaggerated the world is, and instead of resisting it, he uses that awareness to shape how he delivers every line. And that balance is crucial. Because in a film where so much feels mechanical and overproduced, he brings something organic, something reactive. He feels present in a way that most of the film doesn't. Even when he's delivering long stretches of exposition, which, structurally, should slow the film down, you remain engaged. Not because the information itself is inherently compelling, but because of how he delivers it. There's rhythm, nuance, even a hint of playfulness in the way he navigates those moments. And then there's Cogman, a character that, on paper, feels like it should be completely out of place. Almost like a tonal risk that could easily tip into distraction. But somehow, it works, and the reason it works is because of how precise the performance and characterization are. There's a sharpness to him, a clarity of personality that stands in contrast to the rest of the film. He isn't loud. He isn't overwhelming. He doesn't rely on exaggerated behavior to stand out. Instead, he operates with control, with timing, with intention. His humor lands because it's measured, not forced. His presence feels deliberate, not incidental. And that makes every scene he's in feel just a little more focused, a little more alive, because for once, it feels like the scene has direction, like there's an actual exchange happening rather than just movement and noise, and that's rare in this film. Because most of the time, characters don't feel like they're driving scenes. They feel like they're being carried through them, pulled from one moment to the next without clear agency. But Cogman, he holds his ground. He shapes the rhythm of the scene around him, and that subtle shift makes a noticeable difference. Beyond that, there are flashes, small, scattered moments where the film almost aligns with itself. A joke that actually lands because it's built on timing rather than chaos. A brief interaction that feels natural because it allows space for reaction. A sequence that slows down just enough to let the audience engage with what's happening, instead of just processing it. Even certain early scenes, before the film fully accelerates into its more chaotic structure, carry a sense of potential. There's a hint of direction, a suggestion that the film might build toward something cohesive, that it might find a rhythm that balances its different elements. And occasionally, it does. For brief moments, everything aligns just enough to create something engaging, something that feels intentional rather than accidental. But here's the problem. These moments are isolated. They don't connect to each other. They don't build into something larger. They don't establish a pattern that the film can sustain. Instead, they exist in fragments, appearing briefly, then disappearing under the weight of everything else the film is trying to do. They get buried under the next wave of spectacle, the next layer of mythology, the next shift in tone. And because of that, they never have the chance to evolve into something meaningful. And that's what makes them frustrating. Because they aren't just good moments, they're indicators. They show you what the film is capable of when it allows itself to focus. When it allows its elements to align instead of compete. They reveal a version of the movie that could have existed. Not perfect, but more controlled, more engaging, more coherent. But instead of recognizing those strengths and building around them, the film moves past them. It prioritizes expansion over refinement. It chooses more over better. So yes, there are bright spots in The Last Night. Real ones. Moments where the film feels like it's finding its footing. But they remain exactly that, moments. And on their own, they're not enough to hold everything together. They're just enough to remind you that somewhere inside all this chaos, there was a better movie trying to exist. Not a completely different film, not a total reinvention, but a version of this same material that understood how to shape itself, how to prioritize, how to let its strongest elements actually define the experience instead of getting lost within it. At the center of The Last Night, more than the robots, more than the story, more than anything, is Michael Bay. Because this film doesn't just carry his style, it is his style. It's not filtered through anything else. It's not balanced by contrasting influences. It's a pure expression of how he approaches blockbuster filmmaking. And that's where things become complicated. Because on one hand, there's no denying what he can do. Bay has an instinct for scale that very few directors can replicate. He understands how to compose images that feel massive, how to stage action in a way that emphasizes impact over abstraction. There's a physicality to his filmmaking that's unmistakable. When something explodes, it doesn't just look big, it feels heavy. When the camera moves, it doesn't glide, it surges. There's momentum in the way he builds sequences, a sense that everything is in motion even before anything actually happens. And when everything aligns, even briefly, he can create images that linger. Not because they're subtle, but because they're immediate. They hit you in a way that's hard to ignore. Wide shots filled with movement, low angles that exaggerate scale, silhouettes against fire and debris. There's a visual language there that's been refined over years. It's bold, unmistakable, and at its best, undeniably effective. He knows how to put on a show. He knows how to construct moments that feel cinematic in the most direct, visceral sense. And that's the version of Michael Bay that built this franchise, the one that understood how to balance chaos with clarity just enough to make it work. But then there's the other side. The version that The Last Night leans into far too heavily, Because here, that same style doesn't feel shaped anymore, it feels unchecked. It's no longer about selecting the right moment to go big. It's about making every moment as big as possible. And that shift changes everything. Every scene is pushed to its limit, then pushed further. More explosions layered on top of explosions, more camera movements stacked onto already chaotic frames, more visual elements competing for attention within the same shot. It's not escalation in the traditional sense, it's constant intensity with no variation, and instead of building intensity, it starts to flatten it, because intensity only works when it has contrast. When there are moments of quiet, of stillness, of restraint that allow the bigger moments to stand out. Without that contrast, everything begins to blur together. Because when everything is loud, nothing stands out. That's the core problem with what people call Bayhem. It's not just chaos, it's unfiltered chaos. It's a style that has lost its sense of modulation. There's no clear distinction between build-up and payoff, between setup and release. Everything exists at the same heightened level, and as a result, nothing feels like it's actually escalating. There's no restraint, no pacing, no sense of when to pull back and let a moment breathe so that the next one can land with more force. The film is constantly trying to impress you, frame after frame, sequence after sequence, and in doing so, it overwhelms you. Visually, it becomes exhausting. Not because it lacks quality, but because it lacks space. Your eyes are constantly processing information, constantly trying to keep up with movement, light, color, and motion all happening at once. Narratively, it becomes unfocused because scenes don't have room to establish themselves before they're overtaken by the next surge of activity. Emotionally, it becomes distant because there's no pause long enough for you to actually connect with what's happening, and you can feel it in the way scenes are constructed. Instead of guiding you through the action, giving you a clear sense of progression, of cause and effect, the camera throws you into the middle of it. It prioritizes immediacy over comprehension. Instead of building tension gradually, allowing anticipation to form, the film jumps straight to escalation, skipping the steps that make that escalation meaningful. Instead of creating impact through contrast and timing, it just keeps increasing volume, as if louder automatically means stronger. And after a while, that approach stops working. What once felt energetic now feels repetitive, not because the visuals are identical, but because the experience is. The same level of intensity, applied over and over again, loses its ability to surprise. What once felt bold now feels indulgent, like the film is more interested in showcasing its own excess than shaping it into something effective. What once felt like a distinct style now feels like a pattern that hasn't been questioned. That's the turning point. Because this isn't a director losing his ability. The technical skill is still there. The instinct for scale is still there. The visual identity is still intact. But it's a director leaning too heavily into his own instincts, without the discipline to refine them, without the willingness to hold back when necessary. There are still flashes of that older control, moments where the composition suddenly clicks into place, where the chaos aligns just enough to create something coherent. Shots where the scale feels earned because it's framed with intention rather than excess. Sequences where the action flows instead of colliding with itself, where you can actually follow what's happening from one beat to the next. But those moments are fleeting. They're buried beneath layers of constant stimulation, lost inside a film that refuses to slow down long enough to let them resonate. And because of that, they never fully define the experience, they just interrupt it. And that's what The Last Night ultimately reveals about Michael Bay's direction. Not that it's incapable, but that it's unrestrained, that it's operating without the balance that once made it effective. And, when spectacle becomes the only language a film speaks, it stops communicating anything meaningful at all. If there's one thing that truly defines how The Last Night feels while you're watching it, it's not just the action, it's how that action is assembled. Because this film doesn't just move fast, it exists in a state of constant motion, where stillness is almost completely absent. From scene to scene, moment to moment, the editing is relentless. Cuts come rapidly, often before a shot has time to establish itself. Before your eyes have time to settle, conversations don't unfold. They're interrupted, broken into fragments that rarely build into a cohesive exchange. Action beats don't progress. They're sliced apart, presented in pieces that you have to mentally reconstruct. Visual information is delivered in bursts rather than flows. Instead of guiding your attention, the film demands that you keep up. And at first, that pace can feel energetic. There's a surface-level excitement to rapid cutting, a sense that the film is constantly pushing forward. But very quickly, that energy shifts into something else entirely. It becomes disorienting, because good editing isn't just about speed, it's about rhythm. It's about understanding how long a moment needs to last in order to register. It's about knowing when to hold a shot so that the audience can absorb it, and when to cut so that the momentum continues. It's about guiding the viewer's eye through complexity so that even the most chaotic sequences remain readable. Here, that rhythm is missing, or at the very least, it's inconsistent. Instead of building momentum, the film keeps interrupting it. Just as a scene begins to establish itself, it cuts away. Just as a moment starts to develop, it's replaced by something else. The result isn't flow, it's fragmentation. It jumps between locations, characters, and plot lines so frequently that nothing has time to settle into place. One moment you're in the middle of a scene, trying to understand its context. The next, you've been pulled somewhere else entirely, with no transition, no build-up, no sense of how these pieces connect. And that's where the cross-cutting becomes a problem. Because instead of weaving together parallel events in a way that enhances tension, it breaks them apart. It interrupts their progression. You're not watching multiple threads converge, you're watching them compete for attention. You're not experiencing a story unfolding. You're piecing together fragments, and that directly affects the action. Because large-scale battles rely on clarity. They rely on spatial awareness, on understanding where characters are positioned, how movements relate to each other, what the objective is, and how each moment contributes to that objective. But here, that sense of geography disappears. The environment becomes abstract. You lose track of who's where, who's doing what, and how one action leads to the next. The scale is still there, but the structure isn't. And when that happens, spectacle turns into confusion. Not because there's nothing to see, but because there's too much to process without guidance. And then there's something even more distracting layered on top of that, the aspect ratio. Because throughout the film, the image itself keeps shifting. One moment it's framed one way, then suddenly it changes, then it changes again. The composition of the image isn't stable, it's constantly adjusting. And on its own, that might seem like a minor technical detail, something you notice briefly, then move past. But combined with the constant cutting, the lack of rhythm, the overwhelming visual density, it becomes another source of disruption. Your eyes are constantly recalibrating, constantly adjusting to new framing, new proportions, new visual boundaries. And instead of disappearing into the experience, you become aware of it, aware of the construction, aware of the inconsistency. Your focus isn't just being guided, it's being pulled in multiple directions at once. Instead of being immersed in the scene, you become aware of the presentation itself. And that awareness is fatal for a film that depends so heavily on sensory engagement. Because the moment you start noticing the mechanics, the cuts, the framing shifts, the constant interruptions, you're no longer inside the experience, you're observing it from the outside. And once that distance sets in, it's very difficult for the film to pull you back. What's frustrating is that underneath all of this, there are genuinely well-composed shots. You can see the intention, you can see the craftsmanship. There are frames where the scale aligns perfectly with the composition, where the lighting emphasizes texture, where the movement within the shot feels deliberate rather than chaotic. Moments where the visual language actually communicates something clear. But the film doesn't trust those moments. It doesn't let them exist long enough to register. Just as your eye begins to settle, just as you start to process what you're seeing, it cuts away. It interrupts its own strongest images before they have a chance to land. And that's where the disconnect becomes most apparent. Because it's not that the film lacks strong visuals, it's that it refuses to let those visuals do their job. It prioritizes constant motion over meaningful composition, constant stimulation over sustained impact. It refuses to let anything breathe. And that's what this ultimately comes down to. The Last Night doesn't fail because it lacks visual ambition. If anything, it has too much of it. It fails because it lacks control over how that ambition is delivered. Because ambition without discipline becomes excess, and excess without structure turns into noise. When editing becomes this chaotic, when rhythm disappears, even the biggest moments lose their impact. Because impact requires timing. It requires space. It requires contrast. Without those elements, even the most elaborate set piece becomes just another piece of visual information passing by. And all that's left is noise. This is the part where Transformers is supposed to be untouchable. The action. Because if there's one promise this franchise has always made, it's this: even if everything else falters, the action will carry you through. That's the foundation. That's the safety net. But in The Last Night, that promise starts to break. Not because the action is small, not because it lacks scale or technical execution, but because it no longer functions the way action is supposed to function. It loses its clarity, its progression, its sense of purpose. On the surface, everything is there. Massive battles unfolding across multiple locations. Explosions layered into nearly every sequence. Robots colliding mid-air, tearing through environments that are collapsing around them. Entire set pieces built around destruction and movement on a grand scale. It's undeniably bigger than what came before, but bigger doesn't mean better. Because action isn't just about size, it's about communication. It's about orientation. It's about guiding the audience through the chaos so that every movement, every impact, every shift in momentum actually registers. And here, that clarity is constantly slipping away. Scenes often begin with a strong visual hook, an impactful moment, a clear setup, but almost immediately, they dissolve into fragmentation. The camera moves rapidly, the cuts accelerate, and suddenly you're no longer following the action, you're trying to keep up with it. You're watching movement without direction, collisions without context, a series of visually complex events that don't clearly connect to each other. And because of that, you're not experiencing the action, you're decoding it. You're not inside the sequence. You're outside it, trying to piece it together as it rushes past you. And that disconnect removes something essential: suspense. Because suspense doesn't come from constant intensity, it comes from anticipation. From understanding what's about to happen, feeling the stakes build, and then experiencing the payoff when everything finally collides. But The Last Night rarely allows that process to unfold. It skips the build-up and goes straight to the peak. And when every moment is treated like a peak, none of them feel like one. There's very little setup, very little escalation in the traditional sense. Instead, the film exists in a constant state of heightened energy, where each new sequence is trying to outdo the last without establishing a foundation for that escalation. So instead of tension, you get repetition. Instead of excitement, you get fatigue. And that's where diminishing returns start to take over. Because the more the film tries to impress you with scale and intensity, the less effective those elements become. The first explosion might feel impactful. The 10th starts to blur into the rest. The first large-scale battle might feel overwhelming in a good way. By the third or fourth, it begins to feel familiar. Every big moment loses its uniqueness because it's surrounded by so many other moments operating at the same level. There are exceptions. Brief sequences where the film pulls back just enough to restore clarity. Moments where the action slows down, where the camera holds long enough for you to understand what's happening, where a confrontation feels focused, where the stakes are defined, even if only temporarily. And in those moments, you can see the potential. You can see how effective this film could have been if it trusted that approach more consistently, if it allowed its action to breathe, to build, to guide, rather than overwhelm. But those moments don't last. They're quickly overtaken by the next surge of chaos, the next overloaded sequence that resets everything back to maximum intensity. And by the time you reach the final act, the largest, most extended sequence in the entire film, it doesn't feel like a culmination. It doesn't feel like everything has been building toward this point. It feels like overload. Endless movement, endless destruction, endless escalation without variation. And because of that, there's no sense of release. No feeling that you've reached a peak, just a continuation of what you've already been experiencing, stretched out even further. And that's the ultimate failure here. Because The Last Night doesn't lack action, it lacks effective action, the kind that evolves, the kind that directs your attention, the kind that creates a relationship between what you're seeing and what you're feeling. Instead, it just keeps going, louder, bigger, and somehow less impactful every time. On paper, The Last Night sounds like it should be the most ambitious film in the entire franchise, the kind of expansion that redefines the scope of the series, ancient legends woven into science fiction, hidden histories connecting alien technology to human civilization across centuries. Elements like King Arthur, Merlin, Cybertron, all tied together into a single narrative framework. That's not just scale, that's myth-making. The kind of concept that, if handled with care, could add depth to the franchise, could give it a sense of legacy, of meaning that extends beyond individual battles and set pieces. But here's the problem. The film doesn't build that mythology, it delivers it all at once. From the very beginning, it starts layering ideas on top of each other without establishing a foundation for any of them. Transformers have been present throughout human history. Merlin possessed alien technology. There's a staff tied to the fate of the planet, a creator figure manipulating events from behind the scenes, secret organizations guarding ancient knowledge. Each of these ideas, on its own, could support an entire narrative thread. Each of them has the potential to be explored, developed, and integrated into the story in a way that feels meaningful. But instead of exploring them, the film rushes through them, one revelation after another. Introduced quickly, explained briefly, and then replaced by the next concept before the previous one has had time to settle. There's no sense of progression, no layering of understanding, just accumulation. It becomes less about discovery and more about delivery. And because of that, it never feels like mythology. It feels like information. A series of ideas presented in rapid succession without the context or development needed to make them resonate. There's no time to absorb what any of it means. No time to see how these elements connect in a way that feels organic. No gradual unfolding that allows the audience to piece things together. Just constant exposition. And the more the film explains, the less cohesive it feels. It feels less like a story being told and more like a checklist being completed. Like the film is moving from one idea to the next, not because it naturally leads there, but because it has something it wants to include. And that shift from storytelling to assembling changes how everything is experienced. Instead of being carried through a narrative, you're watching it get constructed in real time. And at the center of all this is a surprisingly thin core. Because beneath all the mythology, the actual narrative is simple. There's a powerful object, multiple factions are trying to get to it, and its outcome determines the fate of the world. That's the spine. That's the engine that's supposed to drive everything forward. It's a straightforward structure, one that can work incredibly well if the surrounding elements support it. But here, those surrounding elements don't support it, they smother it. The film keeps adding layers, assuming that complexity will translate into depth. But complexity without cohesion doesn't enrich a story, it obscures it. These added elements don't reinforce the central conflict or sharpen its stakes. They sit on top of it, competing for attention, pulling focus away from what should be the driving force of the narrative. And because those layers don't meaningfully connect, they never feel like part of a unified whole. They feel like separate ideas occupying the same space. So instead of deepening the narrative, they weigh it down. They make it harder to follow, harder to invest in, harder to engage with on a basic level. What should feel expansive instead feels cluttered. What should feel intricate instead feels tangled. Even the biggest ideas, like the connection between Transformers and Earth's past, never fully land. There's potential in that concept. Real potential. The idea that these events stretch back through history, that there's a hidden relationship between humanity and these machines, could have recontextualized everything. But that potential isn't realized. It's introduced, briefly touched on, and then left in the background. It doesn't reshape the stakes. It doesn't change how the characters interact with the world. It doesn't alter the emotional or thematic direction of the story. It's there, but it doesn't do anything. And that's the real issue. Because mythology, when done right, creates a sense of depth that extends beyond the immediate plot. It gives the story roots, it gives it weight, it makes the world feel lived in, connected, meaningful. But here, it becomes clutter, a collection of ideas that never fully integrate into the narrative they're supposed to support. Too many concepts, too little focus, and no clear sense of what actually matters. So instead of feeling like an epic expansion of the Transformers universe, The Last Night feels like a film trying to do everything at once and losing its story in the process. And this is where everything really starts to collapse. Because even if you accept the spectacle, even if you go along with the mythology, the film still has to function as a story. It still has to hold together structurally. And The Last Night simply doesn't. At its core, this is a movie that doesn't know how to organize itself. It introduces too many storylines without establishing how they relate to each other. Too many characters without giving them clear roles within the narrative. Too many moving pieces without a system to guide them. And without that structure, everything begins to drift. Instead of building a narrative that flows from one moment to the next, the film becomes a series of fragments. Scenes don't transition, they jump. Characters don't evolve, they appear, disappear, and reappear depending on what the moment requires. Plot lines are introduced with urgency, as if they're essential, and then quietly abandoned before they can develop into anything meaningful. There's no central thread pulling everything together, no clear sense of progression, just constant movement from one idea to the next. And that directly affects the pacing. Because pacing isn't just about speed, it's about control. It's about how a film distributes its energy, how it balances momentum with clarity, how it allows moments to build and resolve in a way that feels intentional. Here, that control is missing. Some scenes move so quickly that they barely register. Information is delivered, action unfolds, and before you've had time to process it, the film has already moved on. Other scenes linger far longer than necessary, stretching simple exchanges or ideas into extended sequences that don't add new insight or development. So the film creates a strange contradiction. It feels rushed and slow at the same time. Rushed in the way it delivers information and moves between ideas. Slow in the way it lingers on moments that don't justify that time. And that imbalance makes it difficult to stay engaged, because the rhythm never settles into something you can follow. That contradiction becomes even more noticeable because of the runtime. This is a long film. And a long film demands structure. It needs to justify its length by building something, by developing its ideas, its characters, its stakes in a way that leads to a satisfying payoff. But The Last Night doesn't use its time to deepen what it has. It uses it to add more. More subplots layered onto an already crowded narrative. More characters introduced without clear purpose. More exposition inserted to explain ideas that never fully integrate. And instead of expanding the film in a meaningful way, all of that addition makes it feel heavier, more dense, more exhausting. By the time you reach the final act, the film isn't building toward a climax, it's accumulating everything at once. Multiple threads converge simultaneously. Different characters are scattered across different objectives, and instead of creating tension through convergence, it creates confusion through overload. You're not watching threads come together, you're watching them collide. And that's when the runtime becomes fully apparent. Because instead of feeling like you've been guided toward this moment, it feels like you've been carried through a series of disconnected events that are now trying to resolve themselves all at once. The structure collapses under its own weight. And that collapse defines how the ending feels. It doesn't feel like a payoff. It doesn't feel like the natural result of everything that came before. It feels like a stopping point. A place the film arrives at because it has to conclude, not because it is built toward that conclusion. And that's the core issue. The Last Night isn't just overlong, it's overloaded. A film that keeps adding layers without organizing them, expanding outward without reinforcing its center, until eventually there's too much happening, and none of it fully works. There's a moment while watching The Last Night where something starts to feel off. Not just confusing, not just messy, but misdirected. Like the film's attention isn't fully on the story it's supposed to be telling, because in many ways, it isn't. This is a movie that constantly feels like it's looking ahead instead of focusing on the present, like it's more interested in what comes next than in what's happening now. You can feel it in the way the story keeps branching outward. New mythology introduced without resolution, new characters brought in without full arcs. New organizations, new rules, new pieces of world building that expand the scope but don't complete themselves within this film. It's not just telling a story, it's laying groundwork, a framework for future installments, a structure meant to support something larger, something ongoing. And on paper, that approach makes sense. Modern franchises are built on expansion, on connectivity, on creating worlds that extend beyond a single film. But here's the problem. The Last Night forgets to function as a complete movie on its own. Because instead of focusing on telling a clear, contained narrative with a beginning, middle, and end, it keeps planting seeds, and those seeds take up space. They occupy screen time, narrative attention, structural focus. They slow everything down while simultaneously adding more weight to an already overloaded story. And because those setups don't pay off within this film, they don't feel like investment. They feel like distraction. you start to notice that certain plot lines don't feel finished. Certain characters feel underdeveloped. Certain ideas feel like they're only half explored. And that's not accidental, it's structural. These threads aren't incomplete because they were overlooked. They're incomplete because they were never designed to be resolved here. They exist in a kind of narrative limbo, introduced with importance but left without conclusion, as if the film is deliberately holding them back for something further down the line. But that further down the line never materializes. And that's what makes the experience more frustrating in hindsight, because all that setup, the time spent introducing concepts, expanding the world, planting narrative seeds, it doesn't lead anywhere. There's no continuation that pays it off, no follow-through that justifies the investment. So instead of feeling like the beginning of something larger, something evolving, it feels like a dead end. A collection of unfinished ideas that were meant to grow into something but never had the chance, and that recontextualizes the entire film. Because what might have felt like ambition in the moment starts to feel like miscalculation. A story that sacrifices its own clarity and cohesion in service of a future that never arrives. A film that spreads itself outward instead of strengthening what it already has. And that's where the imbalance becomes impossible to ignore. A strong sequel does two things at once. It builds on what came before, expanding the world, deepening the mythology, but it also stands on its own. It delivers a story that feels complete, that feels resolved, even if it leaves room for continuation. The Last Night doesn't achieve that balance. It stretches itself across too many objectives, continuing the franchise, expanding the mythology, setting up future installments, and in doing so, it dilutes its own identity. It becomes less about telling a focused story and more about maintaining momentum for something else. And in the process, it loses sight of the present. It stops asking whether this story works on its own terms, whether these characters have complete arcs, whether this narrative has a beginning, middle, and end that feel connected and intentional. So instead of feeling like the next step in a larger journey, it feels like a film caught in transition, always building, always setting up, but never resolving, and ultimately going nowhere. If there's one place where The Last Night really starts to fall apart, it's the writing. Because everything else, action, visuals, scale, can only carry a film so far. At some point, the foundation has to hold. The dialogue has to feel purposeful. The interactions have to feel authentic. The narrative has to communicate clearly, not just visually, but through what's being said and how it's being expressed. And here, that foundation is incredibly unstable. Let's start with the dialogue. Most of it doesn't feel organic. It doesn't feel like it's coming from the characters themselves. It feels constructed, functional, mechanical, designed to move the plot forward rather than reveal anything about the people speaking it. Characters don't speak because they have something to express. They speak because the script needs to deliver information, to explain a concept, to set up the next sequence, to insert a moment of humor. The dialogue becomes a tool, not a reflection of character, and that creates a disconnect. Because instead of conversations that evolve naturally, you get exchanges that feel predetermined. Lines that exist to serve structure rather than personality. The rhythm of real interaction, pauses, reactions, subtext, is replaced by a constant flow of explanation, and that leads directly into the film's reliance on exposition. The Last Night explains everything, and it does so repeatedly, directly, without much variation in how that information is delivered. There's very little subtlety, very little trust in the audience to interpret or infer. Instead, the film opts for clarity through repetition. But that kind of clarity comes at a cost, because when exposition isn't integrated into the fabric of the scene, when it feels like it's sitting on top of everything rather than emerging from it, it breaks immersion. You become aware that the film is telling you things, rather than showing you or letting you discover them. And over time, that becomes exhausting. Not because the information is complex, but because of how it's presented. It doesn't flow, it accumulates. It doesn't build understanding. It overwhelms it. Then there's the humor, and this is where the inconsistency becomes even more pronounced, because the film clearly wants to inject levity. It wants to break up the intensity, to keep the tone accessible, to add moments of relief between larger sequences. And on a conceptual level, that makes sense. Humor can be an effective counterbalance to scale. But here, it rarely works. The jokes feel forced. Not integrated into the scene, but inserted into it. They interrupt rather than enhance. They draw attention to themselves instead of emerging naturally from character or situation, and because of that, they often feel out of place. Moments that should carry tension are suddenly undercut by humor that doesn't align with the stakes. Exchanges that could deepen character instead pivot into exaggerated reactions or awkward punchlines that don't land. Instead of creating contrast, the humor creates disruption, because the film can't seem to decide what tone it wants to commit to. One moment, it's presenting world-ending stakes, ancient mythology, and large-scale conflict with a sense of seriousness. The next, it shifts into lowbrow humor or slapstick-style beats that feel disconnected from everything around them. And those shifts aren't gradual, they're abrupt. So instead of balancing seriousness and comedy, the film places them side by side without integration. They don't complement each other. They clash. And the more frequently that clash happens, the more it exposes a lack of control over the film's tonal direction. Even the characters themselves reflect this issue. They aren't defined by consistent personalities or internal motivations. They're defined by their roles within the script. One character exists to deliver exposition, another to react, another to provide humor, another to move the plot from one location to the next. Their function dictates their presence, and because of that, they never fully develop into individuals. They don't have distinct voices. They don't have clear identities. They don't feel like they exist beyond the immediate needs of the scene. And when characters are reduced to function, investment disappears. Because if they don't feel real, their decisions don't carry weight. Their dialogue doesn't resonate. Their presence doesn't anchor the story. And without that anchor, everything else begins to drift. That's the core issue. The writing in The Last Night isn't just weak, it's contradictory. It says too much, constantly explaining itself, while at the same time failing to develop the elements that actually need depth. It's overbearing in its delivery, and underdeveloped in its substance. And in a film that's already struggling with structure, pacing, and cohesion, that becomes one of its most critical weaknesses. One of the biggest reasons The Last Night feels so unstable isn't just the story, it's the tone. Because this is a film that doesn't transition between styles, it collides them. On one side, you have something that clearly wants to be epic. It reaches for grandeur through mythology, through scale, through the idea of a conflict that stretches across time and threatens the world itself. There's an ambition there to create something that feels larger than the immediate narrative, but at the exact same time, it keeps pulling in the opposite direction. With slapstick humor, with exaggerated reactions, with moments that feel almost cartoonish in their execution. Elements that might work in a lighter, more self-aware film, but here feel disconnected from the tone the film is otherwise trying to establish. And those two sides never fully integrate. They don't balance each other out. They don't create contrast in a controlled way. They exist in opposition, each one undermining the other as the film moves back and forth between them. You'll have a scene trying to build tension, something serious, something that's meant to carry weight, and then suddenly it's interrupted. A joke that doesn't land. A reaction that feels exaggerated. A shift in behavior that completely undercuts what the scene was building, and in that instant, the momentum disappears. Because tension is fragile, it requires consistency. It requires a sense of control over how information and emotion are being delivered. And once that's broken, once the tone fractures, the scene has to rebuild itself. But this film rarely gives itself the time to do that, so moments don't just weaken, they collapse. And that's where the self-parody starts to creep in. Not in an intentional, self-aware way, but as a byproduct of excess. The film pushes everything so far, scale, intensity, character behavior, that it begins to resemble a version of itself that's been exaggerated beyond its original intent. The action becomes louder, the reactions become bigger, the situations become more extreme, and instead of feeling like escalation, it starts to feel like amplification without purpose. Like the film is trying to top itself constantly, without asking whether that escalation is actually improving the experience. And when that happens, the tone starts to blur. What was once meant to feel epic begins to feel absurd, not because the concept is inherently ridiculous, but because the execution lacks restraint. The fantasy elements only deepen that confusion. Because the idea of blending Transformers with Arthurian legend is, in theory, a bold creative choice. It introduces a different kind of texture to the franchise, something more mythic, more symbolic, more rooted in historical imagination than modern spectacle. It could have given the film a distinct identity, a sense of narrative depth that separates it from the rest of the series. But the execution never fully commits to that idea. It doesn't ground the mythology enough to make it feel believable within the film's world. There's no clear set of rules, no sense of how these elements integrate into the existing reality in a way that feels coherent. At the same time, it doesn't stylize those elements enough to make them feel intentionally heightened or fantastical, so it ends up suspended between two approaches, not grounded enough to feel real, not stylized enough to feel purposeful, and because of that, nothing quite fits. That creates a constant disconnect for the audience. You're never entirely sure how you're supposed to interpret what you're seeing, whether you're meant to take it seriously as part of a larger mythology or accept it as playful, exaggerated storytelling. The film keeps shifting between those possibilities without ever choosing one. Is this meant to be epic? Is it meant to be fun? Is it meant to lean into its own absurdity? The answer changes from scene to scene, and that lack of commitment makes it difficult to engage. Because tone isn't just a stylistic choice, it's a framework. It tells the audience how to process the story. It shapes how moments are perceived. It defines what carries weight and what doesn't. Without that framework, everything becomes unstable, and that's exactly what happens here. The Last Night doesn't just struggle with tone, it loses control of it. It moves between extremes without a clear through line, creating a film that feels inconsistent not just in moments, but in its overall identity. And once that consistency is gone, even the biggest moments start to feel hollow, because you don't know how to connect to them. You don't know what they're meant to represent. For a franchise built around giant robots, the human characters have always served a crucial role. They've been the grounding element, the point of entry for the audience, the emotional bridge that connects the scale of the spectacle to something relatable. But in The Last Night, that connection is almost entirely absent, because the human characters don't feel like people. They feel like placeholders. Let's start with Cade Yeager. He's positioned as the emotional center of the story, the character we're meant to follow, the one who anchors the narrative as everything around him expands, and Mark Wahlberg does what he can within that framework. There are moments where you can see the effort, where he's trying to bring presence, trying to inject energy, trying to hold the scene together. But the issue isn't the performance, it's what the character is given to work with. Cade isn't provided with a clear arc. There's no meaningful progression in how he thinks, how he changes, or what he ultimately represents. He reacts, he responds, he moves from one situation to the next, but those movements don't build toward anything internal. So instead of feeling like a driving force within the story, he feels like someone being carried through it, always present, always involved, but rarely shaping the direction of what's happening. And that limits the impact of every scene he's in. Then there's Vivienne. On paper, she should be one of the most significant characters in the film. Her connection to the mythology positions her at the center of the story's deeper ideas. She's meant to bring intelligence, context, and purpose to the narrative, someone who bridges the gap between history and present events. But the execution undermines that potential. She's introduced as capable, as knowledgeable, as someone with authority within the world of the film, but that identity isn't sustained. The writing pulls her in different directions, layering conflicting roles onto her without fully committing to any of them. At times, she's positioned as the intellectual anchor. At others, she's drawn into more conventional dynamics that reduce her agency. She's tied to the central conflict, but not given enough control over it to feel essential. So instead of becoming a fully realized character, she becomes fragmented, defined not by a clear identity, but by the different functions the story needs her to fulfill at any given moment. And that inconsistency affects the performance. Not because the actor lacks ability, but because the character lacks clarity. There's no stable foundation to build from, no consistent direction to guide how she exists within the film, and that lack of clarity extends across the entire cast. Characters are introduced quickly, given just enough traits to be recognizable, and then moved forward without development. There's no time spent establishing who they are beyond their immediate role in the plot. No moments that allow them to exist outside of the function they serve. They don't evolve. They don't deepen. They don't leave a lasting impression. Even returning characters, those who carry some level of familiarity, don't contribute in a way that feels meaningful. Their presence doesn't add weight, it doesn't expand the narrative, it simply fills space. And when characters are treated that way, they become interchangeable. It's all surface, no substance. And when performances aren't supported by strong characterization, there's a limit to what actors can achieve. They can bring energy, they can bring presence, but they can't create depth that isn't written into the material. That's the core issue. The actors aren't necessarily the problem, the film is, because it doesn't give them the space or the material to create something that resonates. It doesn't allow them to define their characters in a way that feels complete. So instead of forming a connection with these people, you move past them. And in a film this large, this intense, this constantly in motion, that human connection is essential. It's what anchors everything else. It's what gives meaning to the spectacle. Without it, everything else starts to feel even more distant. And one of the clearest signs that The Last Night is overloaded is the way it handles its supporting characters. Because this film doesn't just have a lot of characters, it has too many. And more importantly, it doesn't know how to prioritize them. There's a difference between a large ensemble and an overcrowded narrative. A strong ensemble distributes focus. It gives each character a purpose that feeds into the central story, even if that purpose is small. It creates a sense of hierarchy, who matters most, who supports that, and how each presence contributes to the overall structure. Here, that hierarchy doesn't exist. Throughout the film, new faces are constantly being introduced. Some arrive with dramatic entrances, some with comedic energy, others with a sense of importance that suggests they'll play a key role moving forward. And for a brief moment, the film treats them as if they matter. They're given space, a few lines, a defined function. But that sense of importance doesn't last. Very quickly, they're pushed aside, either absorbed into the background or removed entirely as the film shifts its attention elsewhere. And because that cycle repeats so frequently, it creates a pattern where introductions feel more significant than outcomes. Characters are defined by how they enter the story, not by what they contribute to it over time. There's no follow-through, no payoff, no sense that these individuals are part of a larger, cohesive narrative that's progressing with intention. They feel temporary, and that temporariness affects how you engage with them. Because if the film doesn't invest in its own characters, if it doesn't give them continuity or development, it becomes difficult for the audience to do the same. This is especially noticeable with the comic relief elements, because instead of being woven naturally into the tone of the film, they feel inserted, amplified in a way that draws attention, but not in a way that adds value. The humor doesn't emerge from character or situation, it's layered on top of it, and because of that, it often feels disconnected. Overly loud, overly present, competing with the scene rather than complementing it. Instead of balancing the tone, these moments disrupt it. They break whatever rhythm the scene is trying to establish, pulling the audience out of the experience rather than enhancing it. Then there are the returning characters, faces that should carry weight, but the execution undermines that potential. She's introduced as capable, as knowledgeable, as someone with authority within the world of the film, but that identity isn't sustained. The writing pulls her in different directions, layering conflicting roles onto her without fully committing to any of them. At times, she's positioned as the intellectual anchor. At others, she's drawn into more conventional dynamics that reduce her agency. She's tied to the central conflict, but not given enough control over it to feel essential. So instead of becoming a fully realized character, she becomes fragmented, defined not by a clear identity, but by the different functions the story needs her to fulfill at any given moment. And that inconsistency affects the performance. Not because the actor lacks ability, but because the character lacks clarity. There's no stable foundation to build from, no consistent direction to guide how she exists within the film, and that lack of clarity extends across the entire cast. Characters are introduced quickly, given just enough traits to be recognizable, and then moved forward without development. There's no time spent establishing who they are beyond their immediate role in the plot. No moments that allow them to exist outside of the function they serve. They don't evolve. They don't deepen. They don't leave a lasting impression. Even returning characters, those who carry some level of familiarity, don't contribute in a way that feels meaningful. Their presence doesn't add weight. It doesn't expand the narrative. It simply fills space. And when characters are treated that way, they become interchangeable. It's all surface, no substance. And when performances aren't supported by strong characterization, There's a limit to what actors can achieve. They can bring energy, they can bring presence, but they can't create depth that isn't written into the material. That's the core issue. The actors aren't necessarily the problem, the film is, because it doesn't give them the space or the material to create something that resonates. It doesn't allow them to define their characters in a way that feels complete. So instead of forming a connection with these people, you move past them. And in a film this large, this intense, this constantly in motion, that human connection is essential. It's what anchors everything else. It's what gives meaning to the spectacle. Without it, everything else starts to feel even more distant. And one of the clearest signs that The Last Night is overloaded is the way it handles its supporting characters. Because this film doesn't just have a lot of characters, it has too many. And more importantly, it doesn't know how to prioritize them. There's a difference between a large ensemble and an overcrowded narrative. A strong ensemble distributes focus. It gives each character a purpose that feeds into the central story, even if that purpose is small. It creates a sense of hierarchy, who matters most, who supports that, and how each presence contributes to the overall structure. Here, that hierarchy doesn't exist. Throughout the film, new faces are constantly being introduced. Some arrive with dramatic entrances, some with comedic energy, others with a sense of importance that suggests they'll play a key role moving forward. And for a brief moment, the film treats them as if they matter. They're given space, a few lines, a defined function. But that sense of importance doesn't last. Very quickly, they're pushed aside, either absorbed into the background or removed entirely as the film shifts its attention elsewhere. And because that cycle repeats so frequently, it creates a pattern where introductions feel more significant than outcomes. Characters are defined by how they enter the story, not by what they contribute to it over time. There's no follow-through, no payoff, no sense that these individuals are part of a larger, cohesive narrative that's progressing with intention. They feel temporary. And that temporariness affects how you engage with them. Because if the film doesn't invest in its own characters, if it doesn't give them continuity or development, it becomes difficult for the audience to do the same. This is especially noticeable with the comic relief elements, because instead of being woven naturally into the tone of the film, they feel inserted, amplified in a way that draws attention, but not in a way that adds value. The humor doesn't emerge from character or situation, it's layered on top of it, and because of that, it often feels disconnected. Overly loud, overly present, competing with the scene rather than complementing it. Instead of balancing the tone, these moments disrupt it. They break whatever rhythm the scene is trying to establish, pulling the audience out of the experience rather than enhancing it. Then there are the returning characters, faces that should carry weight, that should bring continuity, a sense of history that ties this film back to what came before. Their presence should add dimension, reminding you that this world has evolved, that relationships have developed over time. But here, they feel more like placeholders than participants. They're present, but not purposeful. They don't drive the narrative. They don't shape events in a meaningful way. Their inclusion feels more like recognition than contribution, like the film is acknowledging them without fully utilizing them. And that creates another layer of frustration. Because it's not just that the film introduces too many new characters, it also fails to use the ones it already has. There's no sense of focus, no clear understanding of who the story actually belongs to. Everyone is given a moment, no one is given enough. Even characters who initially seem central don't receive the development they need to sustain that importance. They're introduced with intention, but not followed through with care. Their arcs begin, but they don't evolve. Their roles are established, but not expanded. And as a result, the film becomes crowded, but not populated. Full of people, but empty of presence. And that distinction matters, because strong supporting characters don't just fill space, they enrich it. They expand the world, reinforce the themes, and support the main narrative in a way that makes everything feel more complete. Here, they do the opposite. They add noise. They add distraction. They fragment attention in a film that's already struggling to maintain focus. So instead of strengthening the story, they dilute it. And in a movie already trying to juggle too many elements at once, that dilution becomes impossible to ignore. There's another issue in The Last Night that goes beyond structure, beyond action, beyond spectacle. And that's how it treats its female characters. Because this isn't just about individual moments, it's about consistency. about how these characters are framed, how they're written, and how much control they're allowed to have within the story. Let's start with Vivienne. She's introduced with a strong foundation, an academic, someone deeply connected to the mythology that drives the entire narrative. On paper, she should be central, not just in terms of plot function, but in terms of perspective. A character who understands the history, who interprets it, who guides the audience through its meaning. But the execution doesn't support that potential. Instead of allowing her intelligence to define her presence, the film keeps shifting her into more familiar, less developed roles. She's positioned as essential to the story, but not as someone who fully commands it. Her knowledge exists, but it's not always reflected in how she's allowed to act within the narrative. Her dialogue doesn't consistently reinforce her expertise. Her decisions don't consistently shape the direction of events, and too often, the film places more emphasis on how she is presented than on what she contributes. There's a disconnect between intention and execution, between what the character is supposed to represent and how she's actually portrayed on screen, and that disconnect becomes more noticeable in the tone surrounding her. Moments that lean into forced humor, awkward interactions, or unnecessary distractions that pull attention away from her role within the story. Instead of reinforcing her importance, they undermine it, again and again. Then there's Isabela, introduced with a different kind of energy, resilient, independent, someone who should bring a grounded strength into the film, a contrast to the larger-than-life spectacle surrounding her. But instead of developing that strength in a way that feels authentic, the film amplifies it without supporting it. She's written to appear strong, but not given the depth or progression needed to make that strength feel earned. Her traits are emphasized, but not explored. Her presence is highlighted, but not expanded. So instead of feeling like a fully realized character, she feels constructed, like an idea of strength, rather than a character who embodies it naturally. And when you step back and look at the broader pattern, it becomes clear that this isn't isolated. Female characters in this film aren't consistently treated as fully grounded individuals. They're positioned, defined by how they fit into the story, how they're framed within scenes, how they interact with the dynamics around them, rather than by their own agency or internal direction. They serve roles, but they don't always control them, and that creates a larger imbalance. Because representation isn't just about inclusion, it's about execution. It's about giving characters the space, the consistency, and the authority to exist as complete individuals within the narrative. Here, that balance isn't maintained. Even when the film introduces characters who are meant to be strong, capable, or central to the story, it doesn't follow through on that intention. It doesn't provide the structure or the writing needed to support them in a meaningful way. And in a film already struggling with tone, structure, and character development, this becomes another layer of disconnect. Another element that pulls the audience further away, rather than drawing them in. Because when key characters don't feel authentic, when their roles feel uneven or constantly undercut, it affects everything around them. It changes how you interpret scenes, how you respond to conflict, how much weight you give to the story as a whole. And that's exactly what happens here. It's not just that the female characters are underwritten. It's that they're misaligned with the film's own intentions. They're positioned to matter but not supported in a way that allows them to. And in a film operating at this scale, that absence becomes impossible to ignore. And then we get to the most important question of all. In a Transformers movie, how are the Transformers? Because at the end of the day, everything else, humans, mythology, narrative complexity, that's all secondary. This franchise is built on one core element, these machines, these personalities. These larger-than-life figures that are supposed to anchor the spectacle with identity. And in Transformers: The Last Knight, they're surprisingly underwhelming. Now, to be fair, on a purely technical level, they're still incredibly impressive. The level of detail in the visual effects is undeniable. Every transformation is layered with complexity. Every mechanical movement is intricately designed. There's a density to the animation that reflects an enormous amount of effort and precision. You can see the craftsmanship. You can feel the scale when the film allows you to actually process it. And the voice work still carries weight. Optimus Prime still has that commanding presence. Megatron still carries a sense of authority. Even within a film this chaotic, those vocal performances inject a level of identity that cuts through the noise. But here's the issue. They don't feel like characters anymore. They feel like components. elements of spectacle rather than individuals within a story. They appear, they engage in action, and then they disappear again without leaving a lasting impression. There's very little emphasis on who they are beyond their immediate role in a given moment, and that's a fundamental shift. Because earlier entries, even with all their flaws, still carved out space for these characters to exist, to interact with each other, to express distinct personalities, to feel like more than just moving parts in a larger sequence. Here, that space is almost completely gone. The Transformers become harder to follow, not just visually, but narratively. Their motivations are thin, their presence is inconsistent. And because the film rarely slows down long enough to focus on them, they never fully establish themselves as central figures. Part of that comes down to how they're presented on screen. There's so much visual activity, so many rapid cuts, so much overlapping motion that it becomes difficult to track individual characters. Designs are highly detailed, sometimes to the point of excess, and when combined with the chaotic editing, distinctions begin to blur. You're not watching clearly defined figures moving through space. You're watching motion layered on motion, and that creates distance. Because when you can't clearly identify who's involved in a scene or follow their movement from one moment to the next, it becomes difficult to invest in what's happening. The action becomes abstract rather than engaging, and that disconnect grows stronger as the film continues. Even when the Transformers are central to the action, they don't always feel central to the story. The narrative keeps shifting its focus toward human characters, toward mythological exposition, toward broader world building, and the very element that defines the franchise is pushed into the background. They're present, but they're not prioritized, and that's a problem. Because without strong, clearly defined Transformer characters, the film loses its core identity. It stops feeling like a Transformers story and starts feeling like a generic, large-scale action film that happens to include them. There are moments, brief ones, where that original appeal resurfaces. A line delivery that carries weight, a visual beat that isolates a character long enough to make them stand out, a confrontation that feels personal rather than purely mechanical. And in those moments, you can see it. The version of the film where these characters matter, where they're not just part of the spectacle, but the reason for it. But like so many other elements in this film, those moments don't last. They're quickly overtaken by everything else happening around them. The scale expands, the focus shifts, and the individuality fades again. And by the time the film reaches its conclusion, you're left with a strange realization. For a movie built entirely around Transformers, it doesn't give you enough of them in the way that actually counts. Now this should have been the film's defining idea. Optimus Prime corrupted, turned against everything he represents. That's not just a narrative twist, that's a foundational shift. Because Optimus isn't just another character within this world, he's its anchor, the symbol of leadership, morality, and stability across the entire franchise. So the idea of that figure becoming something darker, something controlled, something dangerous, should carry enormous weight. It should reshape the story. It should challenge the other characters. It should create a conflict that goes beyond physical confrontation and into something more personal, more emotional. And to the film's credit, it understands the power of that concept. It presents it as a major turning point. It builds anticipation around it. It frames it as if this is going to redefine everything that follows. But then, it barely explores it. The transformation happens quickly, without the build-up needed to fully feel its impact. The internal conflict, the idea of what this means for Optimus as a character, is barely touched on. And the resolution arrives just as quickly, closing off the arc before it has time to develop into something meaningful. There's no space for it to breathe, no time for the consequences to ripple outward, no sustained exploration of how this shift affects the world around him, or the characters who depend on him. And that's where the disappointment becomes unavoidable. Because this isn't just a missed opportunity, it's a wasted one. There's so much that could have been done here. So many layers that could have been explored. What it means for a symbol to lose itself, how others respond to that loss, how trust, identity, and loyalty are affected when the one constant becomes unstable. But the film doesn't engage with those ideas. It treats the concept as a moment rather than a storyline, something to introduce, to showcase briefly, and then move past. So instead of becoming a central thread that drives the narrative forward, it becomes a detour, an idea that exists in isolation, disconnected from the larger structure of the film. Even within the action where the shift should have had the most immediate impact, it feels limited. There is a key confrontation that hints at what this could have been. A moment where the conflict feels personal, where the stakes extend beyond spectacle into something more meaningful. And for a brief instant, it works. You feel the weight of it. You see the potential of what this storyline could have delivered if it had been given the space to unfold. But it doesn't last, because the film quickly shifts focus again back to the larger chaos, the bigger spectacle, the next sequence that demands attention. And Optimus? He returns to being what he always was. The shift that was introduced as transformative is treated as temporary, reversible, almost incidental, as if nothing really changed. And that's the core issue. Because when you introduce an idea this big, something that challenges the very identity of a central character, you can't treat it like a passing moment. You have to follow through. You have to let it ripple outward. You have to allow it to reshape relationships, alter the trajectory of the story, and leave a lasting mark on the world the film has built. Here, it doesn't. It's introduced, teased, and then resolved before it can fully register. Before the audience has time to sit with it, to understand its implications, to feel the weight of what it represents. And because of that, it never becomes what it should have been. Instead of feeling like a defining turning point, it feels like a highlight, something designed to generate interest, to create anticipation, to give the impression of change without committing to the consequences of that change. And in a film already struggling with focus and depth, that kind of missed opportunity becomes even more visible. Because this could have been the anchor, the emotional core that grounds everything else, the storyline that gives meaning to the spectacle, that connects the action to something personal, something character-driven. Instead, it's just another idea, lost in the noise. What makes Transformers: The Last Knight even more frustrating is that it doesn't start badly. In fact, for a brief stretch, it almost convinces you that it might work. The opening has energy, it has direction. There's a sense of intentional setup, of a narrative that's trying to establish something distinct. The historical framing, the medieval battlefield, the connection to ancient legend, it immediately sets a different tone. It suggests a willingness to expand the world in a way that isn't purely driven by modern spectacle, and for a moment, it feels promising, because it introduces the possibility of a new identity for the franchise, something that leans into mythology in a way that could add texture, context, even thematic depth. Then the film shifts, and you get another glimpse, another hint of what could have worked. The early modern-day sequences, particularly those grounded in environments that feel more worn, more affected by conflict, carry a different atmosphere. There's a sense of consequence there, a suggestion that the film might explore the impact of these events in a more grounded way, that it might balance its scale with something more tangible. Again, it almost works. You start to see a version of this movie that's more focused, more deliberate, one that builds its ideas instead of stacking them, one that allows tone and pacing to guide the experience rather than overwhelm it. But then, it slips, because those moments don't build into anything. They don't connect to each other in a way that creates progression. They don't evolve into a consistent direction for the film. Instead, they get lost. Lost in the introduction of new plot lines that fragment the narrative. Lost in the constant shifting between locations that interrupts any sense of continuity. Lost in the film's impulse to keep adding rather than refining, and that pattern doesn't just appear once, it repeats. Throughout the film, there are isolated sequences, small pockets where everything briefly aligns, a scene that finds a rhythm and holds it, a piece of action that's clear enough to follow, a moment of humor that feels timed rather than forced, an interaction between characters that feels grounded instead of functional. And in those moments, you see it again. The version of the film that could have worked. The version that understood how to balance its elements instead of letting them compete. But it never commits to that version. Because every time the film begins to find that footing, it abandons it. It shifts back toward excess, toward something bigger, louder, more complicated. And those stronger moments remain exactly what they are, isolated. They don't influence the rest of the film. They don't establish a pattern that carries forward. They don't shape the overall experience. They simply exist as reminders. Reminders of a better version of this movie that never fully materializes. And that's what makes them stand out. Not because they fix anything, but because they show how close the film came to being something more cohesive, more engaging, more controlled. By the time the film reaches its final act, a different kind of feeling starts to take over. Not just confusion, not just frustration, but something more telling, a sense of cynicism. Because at this point, the film doesn't feel like it's being guided by a clear creative vision. It doesn't feel like it's building towards something with intention. It feels like it's moving because it has to, like it exists because the franchise continues to exist, because the momentum hasn't stopped yet. And you can feel that in the construction. The story doesn't unfold, it accumulates. Pieces pulled in from different directions, ideas layered one on top of another. Not because they're necessary, but because they expand the scope. Because they make the film feel bigger. More mythology, more spectacle, more scale. But underneath that expansion, there's no clear direction holding it together. And that's where the cash grab feeling begins to emerge. Not in a superficial sense, but in how the film prioritizes quantity over cohesion. It keeps adding, keeps escalating, keeps expanding outward, but not because it has something new to explore, because it needs to sustain itself, because the franchise has to keep moving forward, and that creates a disconnect. Because when a film is driven by that kind of momentum, it becomes noticeable. The choices feel less like creative decisions and more like structural ones. Less about what serves the story, and more about what maintains the brand. The focus shifts, from telling a story that stands on its own to continuing a system. And that's when creative exhaustion starts to surface, because this doesn't feel like a franchise discovering new ground. It feels like one repeating itself, amplifying what already exists, making it louder, bigger, more complex, but not more meaningful. You see it in the structure that refuses to simplify, in the characters that aren't given room to evolve, in the way the film keeps reaching for impact without building the foundation that makes impact possible. It's as if the series has reached a point where it no longer knows how to move forward, so it just intensifies everything it already does and hopes that's enough. But it isn't. Because at a certain point, repetition stops feeling familiar and starts feeling tired. The rhythm that once felt reliable becomes predictable. The elements that once created excitement begin to feel expected rather than earned. And when that shift happens, it doesn't just affect individual scenes, it changes how the entire film is perceived. And that's where Transformers: The Last Knight ultimately lands. Not as a bold new direction, not as a satisfying continuation, but as a film that feels like it's running on fumes, like it's trying to sustain a level of energy that the structure beneath it can no longer support, trying to keep something alive that's already starting to fade. And that's the real takeaway. Because this isn't just a movie that struggles on its own terms, it's a movie that reveals something about the franchise itself, that it may have already explored its core ideas, that it may have already reached the limits of its current approach. And now, it's continuing anyway. Now, with everything we've said so far, it might sound like The Last Knight has absolutely nothing going for it, but that's not entirely true, because there is another side to this film. A smaller one, but still present. For some viewers, this does work, not as a tightly written narrative, not as a well-structured piece of storytelling, but as something else entirely, a guilty pleasure. And that perspective matters because it highlights what the film is still trying to offer, even when so much of it doesn't come together in a traditional sense. At its core, The Last Knight is constructed as a sensory experience. It's built to overwhelm the senses, to bombard you with movement, sound, color, scale. It's loud, fast, and visually aggressive in a way that doesn't ask for careful analysis. It asks for immediate reaction. And if you approach it on those terms, if you let go of expectations around depth, structure, and cohesion, it can function in a different way. There are moments where the film leans into that identity fully, where it stops trying to balance its elements and instead embraces the chaos, where the scale becomes the focus, the absurdity becomes part of the appeal, and the sheer intensity of the presentation becomes the point. In those moments, it becomes easier to engage, not because it's refined, but because it's unfiltered. There's a certain kind of enjoyment that comes from that, a willingness to accept the film as spectacle first and everything else second, to focus on the visual impact, the energy, the pace, rather than the narrative cohesion or character depth. And for some viewers, that's enough. They're not looking for structure, they're looking for stimulation. They're not expecting emotional arcs, they're expecting scale. And when the film delivers on that level, it can provide a kind of surface-level entertainment that still has value within that specific context. There are even moments where the film seems partially aware of its own excess. where it leans into the absurdity just enough to soften the edges of its more chaotic elements, where the tone briefly aligns with the idea that this isn't meant to be taken entirely seriously, and in those moments, the experience shifts. It becomes less about coherence and more about momentum, less about meaning and more about sensation. There are also individual elements that help support that version of the film: a performance that cuts through the noise, a joke that lands at the right time, a sequence that, for a brief stretch, balances clarity with scale. Even the music and sound design can elevate certain moments, giving them a sense of impact that extends beyond what's happening on screen. And when those elements align, when the spectacle, the sound, and the energy all come together, the film can be enjoyable in a very specific way. But that enjoyment comes with a condition. It depends on lowering expectations, on accepting the film for what it is rather than what it could have been. Because the moment you start asking more from it, more structure, more clarity, more character development, that version of the experience begins to break down. The foundation isn't strong enough to support those expectations. The story doesn't hold together under closer scrutiny. The pacing doesn't sustain engagement across the full runtime. The characters don't provide enough depth to anchor the narrative. So while there is a version of this movie that works, it's limited. It comes and goes. It appears in bursts, in isolated sequences that briefly capture what the film is aiming for, before slipping back into the issues that define the rest of the experience. And that's why this perspective remains in the minority. Because for most viewers, those moments of enjoyment aren't enough to carry everything else. They're too brief, too inconsistent, too surrounded by a film that struggles in nearly every other aspect. So, yes, The Last Night can be enjoyed, but only if you meet it halfway. Only if you accept it as spectacle first, and everything else second. And for some people, that's exactly what they want. But for everyone else, it isn't enough. By the time the film reaches its end, there's a realization that lands with more weight than anything within the story itself. This isn't just about one installment, it's about the state of the franchise. Because after multiple entries, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The scale increases, the action intensifies, the mythology expands, the number of characters grows. But the substance doesn't evolve alongside it, the depth doesn't increase, the storytelling doesn't refine itself. And that's where fatigue begins to take hold. Because what once felt exciting now feels familiar. What once felt like escalation now feels like repetition. The formula hasn't changed, it's just been amplified. And amplification has limits. You can only go bigger so many times before bigger stops meaning anything. You can only repeat the same structural beats before they become predictable. You can only rely on spectacle for so long before audiences start expecting something more to support it. And this film is where all of that catches up. It doesn't feel like a step forward. It feels like a loop. The same ideas, the same rhythms, the same approach, just extended further, pushed harder, layered more densely. And that's why the reaction to this film feels different. It's not just disappointment, it's finality. A sense that this version of Transformers has reached the end of what it can offer creatively. That continuing in the same direction won't solve the issues, it will only repeat them. And that leads to a clear conclusion. Something has to change. Whether that means a complete reboot, a creative reset, or simply stepping away long enough to rethink the direction. The franchise cannot continue like this. Because what The Last Night ultimately exposes isn't just a lack of quality, it's a lack of progress. And without that, there's nowhere left to go. Because once a franchise stops evolving, once it stops building on its ideas in a meaningful way, it reaches a point where continuation isn't progress anymore. It's repetition. And repetition, without reinvention, eventually collapses under its own weight. So the question isn't just whether this film works, it's whether the franchise, as it currently exists, still does. And based on everything we've seen here, the answer feels clear. It doesn't need to get bigger. It needs to start over. So where does Transformers: The Last Night actually land? After everything. The build-up, the expectations, the scale, the constant sensory overload. What is this movie, really? It's not completely unwatchable, but it's also not good. And that space in between is exactly where the problem lies. Because this isn't a film that fails in a sharp, definitive way. It doesn't collapse spectacularly. It doesn't reach a point where it becomes unintentionally fascinating or uniquely broken. Instead, it wears you down, gradually, relentlessly. It overwhelms you. Not in a way that excites, but in a way that exhausts. It layers moment on top of moment without giving any of them time to settle, and by the time it's over, the reaction isn't outrage or disbelief, it's fatigue, a kind of quiet detachment. This is a film that feels bloated from beginning to end, too long, too loud, too cluttered, and yet somehow still empty at its core. There's always something happening. Constant motion, constant dialogue, constant escalation. Explosions, mythology, characters explaining, plot lines colliding, it never slows down. But very little of it connects. There's no sense of cohesion tying those elements together into something meaningful. It feels like watching a machine that's always moving, always generating output, but without a clear direction guiding it. And that's what makes the experience so strange, because on paper, everything is there. Massive scale, world-ending stakes, ancient legends layered into science fiction. Iconic characters at the center of it all. A franchise built on spectacle that knows how to deliver it. All the ingredients are present, but they're not working together. Instead of building towards something exciting, something that escalates with purpose, it all flattens into a continuous stream of noise. Scene after scene, sequence after sequence, each one trying to outdo the last, but without a structure that allows any of them to stand out. So they blur together. Not because nothing is happening, but because nothing feels like it matters. And that's where the film truly loses its grip. Because even when it achieves something visually impressive, even when the scale is undeniable, you're not drawn into it. You're not engaged by it. You're pushed away, held at a distance by the lack of clarity, the lack of focus, the lack of emotional grounding. The pacing only reinforces that feeling. For a film of this length, it should feel like an event, something that builds, that escalates, that moves toward a climax with increasing intensity and purpose. But here, time stretches. Moments linger without adding value. Sequences extend beyond what they can sustain. The rhythm never settles into something that feels intentional. And by the time the final act arrives, that fatigue has already set in. What should feel like a culmination instead feels like an extension. Not a payoff, but a continuation of the same experience you've already had, just longer, louder, and more overwhelming. So instead of anticipation, there's impatience. You're not waiting to see how it ends. You're waiting for it to end. That doesn't mean there's nothing to take away from it. There are flashes, small, isolated moments where the film almost aligns with itself, a piece of dialogue that lands, a performance that briefly cuts through the noise, a visual that reminds you of the craftsmanship behind it all, moments that hint at something better, something more controlled, more cohesive, more deliberate. But they remain exactly that, flashes. They don't connect. They don't build. They don't elevate the film as a whole. They just remind you of what it could have been. And that's why the overall verdict feels so clear. The Last Night isn't the kind of bad that shocks you. It's the kind that exhausts you. A film that throws everything it has at the screen and somehow leaves you with less than nothing.